All right, here we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. On behalf of Hood College, the Department of Political Science, the Humanities Colloquium, the Department of History, and the African American Studies program at Hood College, all co-sponsors of this event, I want to welcome you to our third event in a year-long series, Race, Politics, and Public Policy. We decided to do this series after a long summer of protests about issues of racial justice and police violence. We wanted to do something that would allow us to learn more about race and racism in America and hopefully come out of it better. My name is Tamerlyn Tucker-Wergs. I'm chair of the Political Science Department at Hood College. My co-host for the evening is Dr. William Allen. He's professor in the Philosophy and Religious Studies Department and organizer for the Sophia Libman NEH Center for the Humanities Colloquium. Most of us know that February is Black History Month, and so tonight's conversation I want to dedicate to the spirit of Sankofa. Sankofa is a West African concept that means looking back to move forward. And I think it's very fitting, and it's a very special honor that during Black History Month, we have this conversation. Roots and Fruits of the Civil Rights Movement, Voices of Alabama, and Oral History Project. Before I go on, I want to establish a couple of ground rules. You should see, if you look at your screen, you should see a question and answer section at the bottom of the screen. And so you can feel free to write your questions there at any time. At the end of hearing from our wonderful presenters, we will answer as many questions as we can. I want to welcome our very special guest this evening. Mrs. Joyce O'Neill is the Selma and Black Belt Sites Coordinator. A Selma native, Mrs. O'Neill is a lifelong member of Brown Chapel AME Church and a foot soldier of the voting rights movement. At Brown Chapel, she serves as historian and tour coordinator. She's on the steward board and the Phillips Robertson Sanctuary Choir. Her service to the denomination includes president, Alabama River Region Conference, the Women's Missionary Society, and the director of lay activities. Mrs. O'Neill was selected by the Connectional AME Church as Outstanding Layperson of the Biennial 2000. Mrs. O'Neill retired after 35 years with the Alabama Department of Human Resources, where she was the first African-American elected as employee representative of the State of Alabama Personnel Board. In 2017, she was inducted into the Alabama Social Work Hall of Fame, along with her sister Phyllis, making them the only siblings to be honored. O'Neill was named a permanent member, Alabama Senior Citizens Hall of Fame in 2014. She's a graduate of Stillman College and received her MSW from the University of Alabama. And she completed Harvard University's program for senior executives in state and local government at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Our second guest for the evening is Ms. Athena Richardson. She is the finance and project manager for the Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium. She graduated from the University of Alabama with a master's degree in American Studies and with a certificate in Museum Studies in 2018. She earned her bachelor's degree in history, minoring in African American Studies from our very own Hood College in 2013. At both institutions, Athena received prestigious honors for her scholarly contributions. The Linda Wyatt and Marlene Spriggs Award in African American Studies from Hood College, and the Elizabeth Meese Memorial Award in Research on Women for her paper, There Is a Bomb, Performance, Voyeurism, and Public History Through Beyonce's Lemonade, from the Department of Gender and Race at the University of Alabama. One of the things that I always emphasize when teaching or talking about the civil rights movement is I love to talk about the people that we don't know a lot about, the ones who, and I want to resist saying the backbone of the movement, and I want to say the face, not the face, but the hands, the feet, the head, the heart of the civil rights movement. And so Mrs. Joyce O'Neill is all of that. We will know her name after today. We're so fortunate to be able to hear her story, and we will be all the better for it. And who better to hear her story than from our own Athena Richardson, one of Hood's own. Many of us were fortunate to teach her and to witness her brilliance, her creativity, her work ethic. I could go on as an undergrad here at Hood College. But to see her, to keep in touch with her and to see her develop as a scholar, now collecting these important stories of struggle and resistance and curating these important sites. I mean, it's just, words cannot describe how much that moves those of us who know her. And what a wonderful feeling it is, and how proud we are of her. So without further discussion and introduction, I want to welcome Mrs. Joyce O'Neill and welcome Ms. Athena Richardson. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Athena Richardson, who's going to give some context. We're going to watch a short film, and she's going to give some context to that film.
Thank you, Dr. Tucker-Works. Even though I graduated years ago, I'm never going to stop calling my professors doctor last name. I know we can stop that after we graduate, but it's a hard habit to break. And thank you for those kind words. Sorry, that means a lot. So let me set the scene for Voices of Alabama. That is our oral history project that was filmed in 2018 and released in 2019 in partnership with the World Monuments Fund. What we did was each of the sites in the consortium, which I will go into depth later about each of the sites, but each of the sites identified 1 to 2 people associated with it's either a church or a historic house or a place of lodging. And we wanted them to tell their stories. And it wasn't necessarily someone that was well known. We really wanted to spotlight, as Dr. Tucker-Works said, people who were the hands and the feet and the heart, who may not always get the recognition they deserve. So as individuals, those videos are about 3.5 to 5 minutes long. But together, the Voices of Alabama platform really does an excellent job of illustrating the richness, not only of the civil rights movement, but of the longer history of these sites in Central Alabama, and how that history and community really helped to form the strength to move forward with the modern civil rights movement. So with that, if you would go ahead and play Joyce's video interview for our Voices of Alabama project. William, they're saying no sound is coming on. You can't hear the audio.
Hi, William,
Okay.
you're
Yeah, I'm gonna
muted.
try this again. So you couldn't hear the sound.
No.
Let me try this again.
And click share computer sound.
I just did that. Yeah, I just
Okay.
did that. So maybe that was the issue.
Okay.
It worked fine before. Let's try it now.
Works.
It works? Okay.
Those stained glass windows were ordered from
Technology.
Germany in 1908 and put in the church when the sanctuary was built. Some Wednesdays, we had to come up in the sanctuary, describe what the scene is in that window, and recite a Bible verse related to that picture. Don't ask me to do that now. The church actually got its start in 1866 when African Americans who were worshiping at the Methodist church in downtown Selma were relegated to the balconies and could not worship on the main sanctuary floor. This church stood as a beacon for people to come where they could worship freely. And it wasn't just about worship, it was also about life. My mother allowed us to skip school, to come to the church, to march, and to participate in the student movement. In order to get to the church, we had to walk through throngs of white men on horseback with all kinds of weapons, and they would taunt us as we walked to the church. My family was always a part of the mass meetings. My grandmother would come to Brown Chapel and sit near the front because Dr. King came in a specific door right over here. And she would get up and reach out and touch him. And then when we got home, we would hear about how it felt to her to lay her hands on him. Bloody Sunday, we were here at the church. For Brown Chapel, it was a regular first Sunday. And as church was ending, people had begun to gather on the steps of the church. And we were sitting in the church and heard the screams, and we heard the horses' hooves. So we ran outside to see what was going on, and that's when we saw the carnage that had followed the people back to the church. People with gashes in their heads. Some of my classmates were in the streets trying to pull their clothing off because it was so full of tear gas. I remember seeing the horses ride up the steps of the church, which was terrible for me because this is a sacred place to me. I was baptized as an infant right there at that altar. One of my favorite memories was after Bloody Sunday, and Dr. King, he issued a call for help, and on Monday night there was a mass meeting. These doors opened both sides of the church, and in came practically 2 by 2 clergy and seminary students from all over the world. They had come to help, and most of them did not look like me. It helped me understand and to know that people did care. Young people who come to tour the site, the first thing I say is always have your truth to speak, and don't be afraid to speak your truth. Don't let anybody speak your truth for you.
All right, thank you so much for playing that, William. So Joyce, going off of your words, speak your truth, I want to go in a little bit deeper about the story of you growing up in Selma. You are a proud Selma native, as you will tell anybody. So I wanted you to just kind of start off talking about what it was like growing up as a child in Selma, just in the community, what that was like.
Well, I always say, because it's the truth, that I am a child of the Jim Crow South. I grew up in the 40s and the 50s and early 60s when Jim Crow was alive and well in the South. I lived in a town that was separated by neighborhoods, but I also grew up in that village that we love to talk about, the village that it takes to raise a child. I grew up in that village. Although we were in the Jim Crow South, we enjoyed our lives. We had activities connected to the church when I was growing up. We might not have had or been able to go to the white theaters, but we had a theater in our community. And we had everything in our community that was in the larger Selma society. And adults at that time made sure that we had access to those activities that were open to us in the Black community. And a lot of times they were very similar to what was going on in the white community. And when I say growing up in the Jim Crow South, by no means do I want pity, because I was not a pitiful child. Like I said, I grew up in a neighborhood that nourished us and nurtured us and encouraged us to be all that we could be. Brown Chapel was the center point of my life, not just spiritually, but socially.
Also, talk a little bit about your mother and your grandmother. I love the story that you tell about your grandmother sitting on the pew so she could lay hands on Dr. King. I think that's something very relatable that we would do today with someone like a Dr. William Barber. But tell us about that and your grandmother's impact on your life.
My grandmother lived with us. Was my grandmother, my sister, my mother and I. My father had left. Both of my parents were teachers and actually met in the deep Black belt of Alabama when they were both teaching at a small segregated school in Greene County. But my father had left, so my mother was the breadwinner. But my grandmother was a force to be reckoned with in the household and in the community. And when there were mass meetings, we did not miss those. We went to every mass meeting, whether it was at Brown Chapel or not, because First Baptist, very nearby, also hosted mass meetings. But my family was very attuned to what was going on, very interested in what was going on. And my grandmother used to say all the time, I won't miss going to Brown Chapel because I'm going to get my freedom as well. And she kept that in her mind, that she was going to get her freedom along with us.
Yeah, I think that's great, because sometimes when we learn about the civil rights movement in school, we don't really get the full picture that it wasn't a generational gap of young versus old, that it really was a hand in hand. I mean, there may have been some disagreements, but there wasn't a large amount of conflict that I think is sometimes what kind of gets filtered down, that the young people are progressive and the older people are not. So I love that story about your grandmother, that she was just as progressive right alongside her granddaughters, moving forward for progress and to get her freedom, as you said. We do have a question in the chat. I want to go ahead and throw it in now. It's from, I'm going to say Miss Copeland. I'm not going to attempt to mispronounce your name. I'm sorry. When you saw people, Joyce, the question is, when you saw people who didn't look like you fighting for the same rights you were fighting for, how did that make you feel? Did you feel like you had support? And did you see change when others joined the movement?
What I saw was people coming to help in a situation that was also very dangerous for them. And it was dangerous because they did not look like me. They were in just as much danger as we were, because they were considered outside agitators. So I knew, even as a 16-year-old sitting in the church that night, that they had come at great risk. As a matter of fact, their cars could not be seen in Selma. So they would park their cars behind someone's home, primarily in GWC homes, and did not drive around Selma. They were driven around by African Americans who lived in the community. But it warmed my heart. And as I stated, watching them come in the church and seeing them come in the church to offer their help made me feel that, what really made me understand that we really were not alone, and that there were others who were willing to face this fight with us and to endure whatever needed to be endured to work towards the goal.
Right, right. And especially as a teenager, like you said, to see that coming together is really powerful and inspirational. I think in a way that, like I said, we can all relate to, especially with the recent uprisings that have occurred. So let's dig more a little bit into Brown Chapel itself and talk a little bit about its place in the community, kind of what's around it, and how that really impacted and helped to sustain the voting rights movement at that time.
Brown Chapel was at that time and still today situated in the middle of a low-income housing complex. Actually, the movement moved to Brown Chapel because Brown Chapel did not have the initial mass meetings. But Tabernacle, which is on a major thoroughfare, Highway 80 in Selma, which is a highway that goes from coast to coast, they were very vulnerable. And there had been plenty of threats. Because Brown Chapel was isolated within that housing complex, and at that time, a lot of the people living there were members of the movement. They were coming to mass meetings, they were doing what they could, although a lot of them could not march during the day because their jobs were threatened. But it made the movement more secure, the mass meetings more secure because of where Brown Chapel is located and was located at that time. And it was a central part of Selma when I was growing up. It was one of the biggest churches that seated a large number of people. It seems like when I was a child, Brown Chapel could seat 600, but when we started having Bloody Sunday reenactments, the fire marshal said we could only seat 400, so we became smaller from 1965 to today. But that church was a center point for people in Selma. Young people who lived in GWC homes might not have joined the church, but they were there for all of the youth activities because the youth director at that time would draw kids in from the community.
Okay. And talk a little bit about just the building itself. I love all the churches in Selma, which are Brown Chapel, Tabernacle Baptist, and First Colored Baptist, and they all are very unique in their architectural styles. But talk a little bit about Brown Chapel, because we see the church in the historical images, but we don't really get to dig into that.
Brown Chapel was built by a Black man by the name of A.J. Farley, and the present structure was built in 1908. When the church first started and actually became a church, it was a little white frame building, clapboard building. And then in 1908, the parishioners built the structure that you see in all of the pictures. Brown Chapel is a very imposing building. It's beautiful in design. It's on the Romanesque architectural style. And it's known by its twin cupolas that you can see on the church, but inside is where most of the beauty is to me. The pews that are in the church now are the original pews from 1908. I always say when I'm doing tours that we don't know a whole lot about Mr. A.J. Farley, but we do know that he was a master craftsman. Because when you look at the woodwork inside the church, and I invite people to come down when we get out of COVID, to come see Brown Chapel and see it for yourself. The stained glass windows were ordered from Germany. When we were taught that when I was a child, I used to wonder how could Black folk afford what went into beautification of Brown Chapel. That they did what they had to do to leave a lasting structure there for us in order to worship in peace.
Yes, and those windows are beautiful. I really love the pipes of the organ, which I think you can see when I get to the presentation, but the whole church is very well built, very beautiful, and it does make that lasting impact on a visitor, and I'm sure as a congregant as well. So Bloody Sunday, that's one of the most well-known events of the civil rights movement. Talk a little bit more, we touched on it briefly in the video, but talk a little bit more about what that day was like for you as a teenager in the city. What was it like?
Bloody Sunday was the first Sunday in March in 1965. And for Brown Chapel, it was a first Sunday where we celebrated the Lord's Supper. We had church as we normally do, but as church was ending, we could hear people gathering on the steps of the church to march from Brown Chapel to the bridge. My mother and I did not march. My sister, who's 11 months older than I am, did go to the bridge, but my mother told her she could only go if she stayed at the back of the line, which was a good thing. I think being at the back of the line helped save her from some of the incidents that others were involved in. But the march started from Brown Chapel. A lot of us waited at the church until they came back, and what we heard was screams. We could hear the horses' hooves. So when we went outside, we saw the horses actually riding up the steps of the church as they were beating marchers who were trying to seek sanctuary in the church. Our pastor's wife at the time was Mrs. Alice Lewis, who was a nurse. And Mrs. Lewis hurriedly set up a first aid station next door to the church in the parsonage. My mother and I went over to help her, and she had this water and stuff to try to get tear gas out of the eyes. But people were bleeding from the head. And I know the records at the only Black hospital in Selma at the time was Good Samaritan Hospital. Their records show that 58 people were seen at the hospital that day, and some were admitted to the hospital. And if you will recall, John Lewis had gotten into good trouble, and he ended up in the hospital. He suffered a concussion. He did come back to the church and had to be convinced to go to the hospital, which he did, and he was admitted. That march and the visual I have of that still to this day is terrible, because I cannot reconcile in my mind how people can be so inhumane towards other human beings.
Yeah, and that's a question that we are still asking. And I do want to acknowledge that I see the questions in the chat. We're gonna get to them. We're gonna, I promise. But keep asking them. I love seeing the questions as I'm having this conversation with Joyce. So post Bloody Sunday, that was one of the events that kind of led to Turnaround Tuesday and the eventual Selma to Montgomery March. Kind of talk about, what that was like, if you were involved or seeing it as being a part of the community as a foot soldier, kind of the post Bloody Sunday aftermath leading into the Selma to Montgomery March.
Well, Dr. King was not in Selma on Bloody Sunday, contrary to what a lot of people believe. He was not in Selma. That march was actually led by John Lewis and Hosea Williams and some others who were leaders in the movement, both Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee people and SCLC people, Southern Christian Leadership Congress people. But Dr. King issued a call for help, and we've talked about the help that came, who also marched on Bloody Sunday. But on marched on Turnaround Tuesday. They came in on Sunday night and Monday. And on Tuesday, there was a march to the bridge led by Dr. King. I did march to the bridge that day for Turnaround Tuesday. The idea was to go to the bridge, kneel to pray, and then come back to the church, which we did. We saw no violence on Turnaround Tuesday. And then that was March the 9th. Bloody Sunday was March the 7th, turnaround Tuesday was March the 9th. Then on March 21st, the beginning of the successful march from Selma to Montgomery started from the steps of Brown Chapel. My sister, my mother, and I marched that first leg. Everybody could not march all the way to Montgomery. Some people have asked when I've done tours, why weren't there thousands of people marching to Montgomery? Well, it would have been impossible to protect thousands of people on the road, on Highway 80 from Selma to Montgomery for that 54 miles. So a select group of about 350 were selected to take that march. But you could march any leg of the march that you wanted to. So we marched that first leg. And then when the marches reached Montgomery, if I'm getting ahead of your questions, let me know.
Oh, no, no, you go ahead.
And when the marches reached Montgomery, this is one of my favorite memories as well. Harry Belafonte organized a concert and a big show on the campus of St. Jude in Montgomery, which was a Catholic property. It had a church, a school, and a hospital on that property. But they had a lot of vacant property. They hurriedly erected a stage. I think they pulled together flatbed trucks to make a stage. And all of these people came at Harry Belafonte's request. And I remember, I'm going to date myself.
That's okay.
I remember, I like Westerns. And I was so thrilled when the Cartwright Boys, I don't know who on this call remembers Bonanza, but it still comes on today on some stations. One of them is TV Land, I think. But the Cartwright Boys, all three of them came to Selma, and then they came on over to Montgomery for the celebration. But you had people like Harry Belafonte performing. Sidney Poitier was there. Tony Curtis. Peter, Paul, and Mary was a folk group that was there. And then one of my favorites, Joan Baez, also performed. But Joan Baez had been in Selma all along during the movement. She was there pretty much throughout because she would get little groups of little children and take them off in a corner and teach them freedom songs. But that was a night that was a celebration. The marchers had reached Montgomery and nobody had died on the road from Selma to Montgomery. And then my mother drove us over for the celebration. We came back home and got up early the next morning and went back to St. Jude and joined the marches from St. Jude to the state capitol. Now, I remembered on that march that there were a lot of taunts again. Whites were all along the route, the march route. But there were Black people and white people in different clusters along that route, but the whites were very ugly. But the Blacks were very encouraging, those who were not marching with us.
Talk a little bit about Highway 80, because we hear about Selma to Montgomery March. Just, you know, that's a long road. For anyone that has not been to Alabama, I'm to Maryland, it's kind of like if you were going to drive from Baltimore to Frederick, but without an interstate. Just the thinking about the length of time. It's about what, hour and a half, Joyce?
It's about an hour.
Yeah, about an hour. So let me adjust. So maybe Columbia to Frederick, that's about 45 minutes, but without the interstate and lots of trees. And now it's a 4-lane highway. And back then it was 2 lanes. It was even less.
It was 2 lanes.
Yeah, it was 2 lanes. So that's part of the reason why marching in groups, a large group, just wouldn't work, because they would be so exposed to people hiding in trees and doing things, terrorizing, really, let's just call it what it was, terrorizing nonviolent protesters. So I wanted to highlight that because it really is a dedication to walk that many miles over the course of many days. It's a different level of commitment.
And when you see the pictures of some of the marchers, their shoes have torn up. They have rags on their feet where the feet had started to bleed. It wasn't an easy march. And I made the statement that no one died on the way to Montgomery, but After the march, Mrs. Viola Liuzzo lost her life on Highway 80 when she was ambushed. Someone a shot rang out in the night into her car, and she was killed instantly on Highway 80 the night after the march.
And there was someone else in the car with her, right? And he had to pretend to be dead. Is that what happened?
Well, we had heard that he pretended to be dead, but he returned to Selma year before last for the first time for a foot soldiers breakfast during Jubilee weekend, a Bloody Sunday weekend. And he said he did not play dead. He said he actually got out of the car and hid. But then some of those trucks, flatbed trucks that were carrying students back home from the march, picked him up. One of them picked him up and got him to Selma. But once he got to Selma, he reported to the police what had happened to Mrs. Liuzzo. And they questioned him. They tried to make him admit that he and Mrs. Liuzzo had had a sexual relationship, that kind of thing. Given them, they wanted a reason to hang him, to lynch him. And they couldn't get that reason out of him, but his family was eventually run out of Selma. So some very terrible things continued to happen after the march.
Right. And that's a really good segue, because I'm thinking about, the legacy of having these events happen to you so early in your life. Before you're even 20, you've had some world-shattering events occur. So how did you carry those events with you? Were you angry? Did it inspire you? Just talk a little bit about that.
Well, I haven't ever been angry. A lot of things made me sad, but I realized early on that the anger does not help me as an individual. As a matter of fact, I think anger works on you physically, works on your heart, works on your mind. And my mother talked to us about moving forward and using what had happened as a springboard to do better ourselves, try to help make this world a better place, and not just to use the movement as what it was, just a movement, but to use it to tell the world what needs to be done and how the world needs to change, and how the experiences we had need not happen again, but we know from this past summer that they are happening again, which is so unfortunate.
And we're going to get back to that, because I see there's been some questions in the chat about that. But I do want to ask you about how you got involved with the preservation of the building of Brown Chapel and kind of your early interactions with that before the consortium came in.
I love Brown Chapel because it was such a part of my life growing up, and not just church, as I stated earlier. It was our social outlet as well. So I loved it, and I wanted to see it thrive, and I wanted to see it brought back to its glory. The glory days that I remember as a child growing up in Brown Chapel. And I wanted to continue to be a citadel to freedom, but I wanted to be not a crumbling citadel, but one that's still standing strong in the community. And I wanted to be the place where the community can still feel comfortable coming, not just to worship, but to see Brown Chapel as a place where they can seek solace, that they can find food, that they can find shelter, whatever they need. I love it. I will always love it because it was such a part of my life.
I love that. I love that. But you still didn't say, so how did Brown Chapel kind of get involved? There's grants available, just the process of, okay, we need to preserve this building. What do we do? What was that like?
Well, we have a foundation who was getting grants to preserve the building. That's a separate foundation from the church. But the pastor was also looking for ways to preserve the church and for any outlet he could find to preserve the church. And then when the consortium contacted the pastor for a representative, and he named me as the representative to the consortium, I was delighted because that gave me an opportunity to see and work with other people who were trying to preserve their sacred places and their museums and their houses or whatever they had that spoke to that movement. So the consortium was a lifesaver. And it was a lifesaver for me in that it helped do some of the things, has helped to do some of the things that the church needs, and has also pointed the church in the direction to get the help that's needed.
That's so good to hear. The consortium has been around almost 3 years now, but it feels like it has been longer with the amount of things that we've been able to accomplish. So Joyce, what do you think? You want to continue the conversation? Or you want to talk about the consortium? What do you think?
I do want to say that the consortium has been a lifesaver for the 20 sites, those who are able to continue to work with the consortium and all of them have not, but some of them are very strong in the consortium and are very connected to the consortium. And I think it has been one of the best things that ever happened to the 20 sites. And to be named to the World Monuments Fund watch list was monumental for us. And it put us out there in a way that we had not been before. We had tours and we still have tours, but we didn't have the recognition that was needed or that would be wonderful for the sites. We didn't have that recognition as what we had done during 1965 and before, because some of them were involved before 1965. Brown Chapel had been involved before 1965, but people didn't know the story. You know, you can only tell so much during a tour, but people don't know our stories, so we need our stories out there because there's some very powerful stories. And the consortium has seen fit to get our stories out there.
Okay, that's so true. That is something we have found and have heard from the consortium sites. Let me just go ahead and dig into some of these questions for you, Joyce, because there's so many. There's a good question. How did you feel witnessing the protests this past summer? You touched on this a little bit, but just go into it with a little bit more detail. Are there any words that you would like to share with young and aspiring activists who feel like their voices won't be heard?
When I saw all of the protests this summer, I thought, here we go again. And it's so needless because we should have changed by now. But what I would say to young people is when I tell young people to speak their truth, I also tell them to find a project that they can commit themselves to. Find a cause to commit to and hold fast to that cause. Now, the only thing I saw during some of the protests this summer was the meeting violence with violence. And we knew in 1965, and I know things have changed and people think differently, but in 1965, our cause, which was to get voting rights, would have been lost if we had met violence with violence. The whole purpose of the marches, the whole purpose of the movement would have been lost to that violence. And then we would not have the voting rights that we have now. And although we need to continue because the voting rights are being whittled away little by little, so we have to be ever vigilant. But we have to do things in a way that we can be heard and that our voices will be heard and not silenced. And a lot of times when you meet violence with violence, the violence speaks louder than the message. So we want the message to be heard, that the young people are out there. I'm very proud of young people who are doing what they're doing. And I remember when the shooting happened at Parkland, and some commentator made the statement that this was the first movement by young people. And I called my sister and I said, did you hear that? This was not the first movement by young people. The first organized movement by young people was in Birmingham and in Selma in the 60s. So I think that we need to encourage our young people to fight for what is right. We're old now. I can't even walk across the bridge anymore, would love to, but we're old now and we need somebody to take up this fight for our rights because they're being eroded as we speak.
That's right, that's right. That's so, so important. And talking about nonviolence, who were the teachers of nonviolence in terms of not reacting during the marches?
Dr. King and SCLC primarily taught nonviolence. As a matter of fact, as student participants, we had classes. We had classes in the basement of First Baptist Church and at Brown Chapel. Before you marched, you were told, if you could not remain nonviolent, please don't get in the march that day. Don't march that day. We were constantly reminded that this was a nonviolent protest and that we had to remain nonviolent in order to participate. We were taught how to protect ourselves if we were accosted by deputies with billy clubs, how to get down on the ground and cover your head. We were always told that it was better to have a broken wrist than a cracked skull. Now, can you imagine at 16 years old, 17 years old, being told that you didn't need your skull cracked? But no. We were taught, along with those lessons, we were taught the importance of nonviolence.
Okay, thank you, Joyce. Thank you. That's a question I always think about, as I think about Highland School, and I wouldn't have had the patience to even be trained, let alone do it in real time, because that anger is so hard to control. And I think that's really one of the important things, is about exhibiting the control over the people who have uncontrollable hatred against you. And that's why the nonviolence is so powerful, because it's the control. Now, what, like you said, there's different takes on that today, but that's what made it so impactful in 1965.
And may I add to Athena that those of us as students who were marching, we were marching for our parents. My mother was an 8th grade social studies teacher at the segregated high school. She could not vote. She had gone to register to vote, and everybody thinks that the literacy test was always a written test. But sometimes questions just came to the registrars that they wanted to give to keep people from voting. And they asked her to recite the preamble to the Constitution, which she did, because she required her students to learn it. Then she was denied the right to vote. Her application was stamped, denied. The next time she went, she was asked to recite the entire Constitution. And who could do that? And what's so sad is the registrars couldn't even sign their names. But they were requiring this of our parents to get a right that had already been afforded them by the Constitution. So we knew that. So with all deliverance, we went out to try to help our parents get the right to vote. We organized as students. We had a student president who's Charles Malden, who lives in Birmingham, Alabama now, and he was a high school classmate of mine. And we met as students in order, every time there was a march, there was a meeting before the march. So we knew what we were doing, and we knew the importance of what we were doing. It was not just a day out of school.
Right. It wasn't a holiday, it wasn't a vacation. Right, well, this is going to be a hard pivot. But we do want to recognize everyone's time, and I do want to take a little bit to talk about the consortium and all the sites so that we can go back to having these answering questions with Joyce, who I love. I love hearing her story. I love working with her as the Selma and Black Belt Sites coordinator. And as she said, once COVID is over, please come down to Alabama and visit all of these sites. It will change your life. It changed mine when I visited before I even knew it was the consortium, but that's another story for another day. So let me go ahead and get quickly my screen set up. So we've already talked a little bit about the origin of the consortium, that we basically came about as a proposition from a group called the Educational Foundation of America, who approached the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute in 2017, asking if the Institute could nominate some sites to the World Monuments Fund Watch. And the World Monuments Fund, which is based in New York City, every 2 years, they released a list of about 20 to 25 sites around the world for international recognition and to bring awareness to the sites for historic preservation. And in 2018, the consortium was named to that list, which was notable not only for being only one of 2 sites in North America for that cycle. We are currently, to this point, the only group of sites to be named to the World Monuments Fund Watch. And this is in the company of places in China and India and Lalibela and Ethiopia and Bears Ears National Monument. So we are in great company in that respect. In terms of criteria for being a site in the consortium, the building still needed to be in place. There needed to be a documented role in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. And there needed to be an available person to respond to emails and questions and feedback. And once we received that nomination, that's kind of when the consortium said, okay, well now what are we going to do? What are the next steps? We've got this amazing group of sites. What are we going to be doing? So for the next 2 years, we incubated underneath the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And last year, we were able to step away and form our own organization. And I'll talk a little bit about what we do. But first, I want to go through all of the sites. There are 20. So please bear with me. They all have very special significance and deserve a little bit of shine as well. And we like to begin in Montgomery because chronologically that was the Montgomery bus boycott and also the ending point for the Selma to Montgomery voting rights movement. So first we have the Benmore Hotel. This was built in 1945 and it offered safe lodging, meeting, and vibrant social activity space. It was also formerly the home of Malden Brothers Barbershop, which was on the first level, and the most famous customer was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We have Dexter Avenue King Baptist Church, which is well known. This is the church that Dr. King pastored during the Montgomery bus boycott. He was brought in to replace Reverend Vernon Johns, who was seen as too radical by the congregation and was an early change seeker. So that's one of the people in terms of expanding the narrative that is not as well known. And the church is located at the foot of the state capitol building, and the land that the church is built on was a slave pen. Then we have Dexter Avenue King Church Parsonage, which is where Dr. King and his family lived while he was pastor of Dexter Avenue Church. The parsonage was bombed on January 31st, 1956. A hole ripped through the front steps and the concrete is scarred, and that is still visible to this day. First Baptist Church, also known as Brickaday, was founded in 1867. The name comes from the congregants being encouraged to pick up bricks as they went on about their daily travels to bring to the church as it was built. It's mainly known for its involvement in the siege of First Baptist, which was in May of 1961. And this is where freedom riders were brought after they were attacked at the Greyhound bus station. They sought refuge at Brickaday, and they were actually held hostage by a hostile mob that gathered around outside of the church for several hours. And then eventually, through intervention of the National Guard, people were released from the church, and the freedom riders were transported to the Dr. Richard Harris house, which is on the same block as the Dexter Avenue Parsonage. which served as a safe haven for the Freedom Riders until they were able to get on the bus and try to continue their journey that summer. We also have the Jackson Community House and Museum, which was purchased by the Montgomery City Federation of Colored Women's Clubs for 25 adult clubs and 15 youth clubs. One of those most notably was the Women's Political Council, which helped initiate the Montgomery bus boycott. Mount Zion AME Zion Church, this is the original building, was built in 1869 in the Peacock Tract area. They hosted a meeting on December 5th, 1955, where the Montgomery Improvement Association was formed and Dr. King was elected as its president. 10 years later, in 1965, Mount Zion was one of the final stops during the Selma to Montgomery March. Old Ship AME Zion Church was established in 1852 and is the oldest Black congregation in the city of Montgomery. President William McKinley and Frederick Douglass have spoken from its pulpit, which is still in use today. So if you have a chance to come to Montgomery, you can stand in a place where Frederick Douglass stood. I always do when I go there because that's just a really cool thing to say and a really cool thing to do. And finally, we have the Trinity Lutheran Church Parsonage, which is now United Church Parsonage. It was the home of Reverend Robert S. Gratz, the white clergyman who served a Black congregation, and he openly supported the Montgomery bus boycott and was secretary in the Montgomery Improvement Association. In retaliation, him and his family were regularly targeted by the Ku Klux Klan. The parsonage was bombed 3 times. The largest bomb failed to fully detonate. If it had, the force of the blast would have leveled the block, killing the Gratz family. And Reverend Gratz and his wife recently passed away. Reverend Gratz this summer and his wife in December. And we move on to Birmingham, which became the focal point of the nation in 1963. We have historic Bethel Baptist Church, which served as the headquarters for the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, which was an organization founded in response to the Alabama Attorney General banning the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, from conducting its business unless the membership rolls were made public. So since the ACMHR was a religious organization, they got to maintain private roles. They were also important during the 1961 Freedom Rides and led by pastored by Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who was not only a leader of the Birmingham movement, but he was a key strategist for civil rights campaigns throughout the state. The Bethel Baptist Church was bombed multiple times as well. Then we move on to Old Sardis Baptist Church, which was formerly just Sardis, which hosted many of the meetings of the ACMHR, and its location, which is near a former Jewish cemetery and bordering an all-white neighborhood, protected it from the racially motivated bombings throughout the city, which earned the nickname Birmingham for the city of Birmingham. 16th Street Baptist Church, which I don't need to go into too much detail about, but this current building was erected in 1911 after the first church had to be demolished for being out of code. Out of code really being it was a nicer church than the white churches in the city, and they didn't like that. So they were told to knock it down. The version that you see today was designed and built by Black architect Wallace Rayfield, who built several churches and buildings throughout the South. And 16th Street is well known for the September 15th, 1963 bombing that killed 4 young girls and put pressure on the government to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act. On the same block as 16th Street, we have St. Paul United Methodist Church, with a congregation founded in 1869 and the building built in 1909. It was led by the Reverend Dr. Joseph Lowry during the Civil Rights Movement, and mass meetings and trainings for young demonstrators who participated in the Children's March, where you see the fire hoses and the dogs at Kelly Ingram Park began and were trained to prepare for that march at this church. And finally, we have the Ballard House, which is built in the 1940s by a Black contractor named Leroy S. Gillard for Dr. Edward H. Ballard, a Black pediatrician and obstetrician. In 1959, Dr. Herschel S. Hamilton Sr. moved his medical practice into this building, and it hosted many meetings of civil rights organizers and served as a field hospital during the 1963 marches. Finally, we moved to Selma in the Black Belt. And I just want to quickly point out that Black Belt is not just the name for the soil in the region, it's also the name because of the people who were living there enslaved. You know, that's not white soil. It's black soil, black people. That's how the name Black Belt came to be, and it's still a highly concentrated black population in the Black Belt to this day. So we have Brown Chapel, which the lovely Joyce O'Neill has shared so much about its history with us, and you can see a little bit of the interior that she was talking about in the German stained glass windows. We have First Colored Baptist Church, which was organized in the early 1840s by Samuel Phillips, a freed slave. And it served as the headquarters for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as Snick, which supported the Selma to Montgomery March. We have the Sullivan and Richie Gerard Jackson home, which was built in 1912, and it tells the family history through 3 generations. It served as a guest house for W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And then 50 years after that, it hosted Dr. King while he was in town helping to plan the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. Then we have historic Tabernacle, which Joyce has talked about. It was built in 1922 in a classical revival style designed by David T. West, who was a former enslaved person who did not have any formal training. As Joyce mentioned, it was the site of the first mass meeting for voting rights in Selma in 1964. I do want to talk about the identical portico entrances. They were intentionally built that way by Mr. West because Highway 80 was segregated. So the congregation could not enter by the front of the building, in which case that's where you will see the church sign and the historical marker. So what he did to get around that is he built identical entrances. So this side entrance, I believe that's Mentor Street, correct me if I'm wrong, Joyce. That's the side that the congregation used to enter, but it looks exactly the same as the side facing Highway 80. And to this day, the congregation still uses Mentor Street more so than Highway 80. But it's a way to have equal grandeur in the face and as a direct kind of standing up in the face of Jim Crow segregation. Then we have the Safe House Black History Museum, which is in Greensboro, which anyone familiar with the movie Forrest Gump, Greensboro is a real town in Alabama. It's owned by the Burroughs family, which was a family of civil rights activists. And 2 weeks before Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, there was an assassination attempt on his life, and he was harbored in this home in Greensboro, where the Klan drove up and down the street most of the night, and the neighboring men in the community surrounded the house with guns to protect Dr. King and his life. And then finally, we have the Matthew and Emma Jackson Snick Freedom Complex in Whitehall, where a 16-year-old John Jackson asked his parents if they would allow SNCC workers, including Stokely Carmichael, to a place to stay in Lowndes County where they could host meetings and be protected. The Jacksons agreed, and this house demonstrates the power of personal community ties to move organizing efforts forward. So thank you for your patience as I went through a quick tour of all the 20 sites. So what is it that we do? We have 4 priorities. I'm going to talk in depth about 2 of them today: documentation and in depth, quote unquote, documentation and research and direct services to the sites. These priorities came about as the result of collaborative decision-making based on needs assessments, surveys, and group discussions. We work with the sites at the speed of the sites and always for the consortium does not in any way, shape, or form dictate to the sites what it is that we need, what it is that we think they should do. It is always the site saying, this is what we would like to learn, this is the help that we need, and then us figuring out how to provide that assistance. So for documentation and research, that's come in 2 forms. We've done documentation and archiving. We did an archive seminar where we provide them with acid-free paper and boxes and folders and encourage the sites to identify and collect materials specific to its history. And then also going in hand with that is the Voices of Alabama Oral History Project, or is where we get the video from Joyce and the 18 other videos of the sites as well. That website is voicesofalabama.org. So if you like Joyce's video, I encourage you to go to that website and watch the other videos and read the stories about the sites. We also worked with the National Park Service and the Historic American Building Survey. Photographic documentation, which is where you saw all the beautiful pictures of the sites. Gerard Ortiz, who is basically the current photographer for the National Park Service, this was the first time he used his large format camera system to capture architectural detail. So we were very honored that we were the first ones to be documented in this way. I'm going to skip over the trailer for Voices of Alabama in the interest of time and talk a little bit about historic preservation. These are the doors of Old Strip AME Zion Church in Montgomery that they were able to restore through a mini grant provided through the consortium. And this is what they chose to do for their mini grant. As you can see, even just changing restoring the doors back to their original color, restoring the hardware back to its original gold, it really brings to life what the church would have looked like, and it continues to look like for future generations. We have also worked with the School of Architecture at Tuskegee University, who began offering historic preservation courses in 2018. And those students worked with the consortium in terms of documenting and architectural drawings. They came and presented at a training retreat that we had with the sites where they could get hands-on experience about what preservation is like. And that's another thing that the consortium does, is we do a lot of workshops and trainings on a variety of topics, from historic preservation to organizational development. And since with COVID, we have had to pivot to do those trainings virtually, but we are still able to serve the sites and help assist them navigating this COVID time as well. And I did want to close with our 5 core values and our mission, which is to promote the legacy of the civil rights movement by preserving historic buildings, protecting authentic stories, and empowering communities through the 5 core values, which are creating community, preserving spaces, protecting stories, teaching and learning, and expanding the table. And I did just want to briefly show, if you're on social media, please follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and our website, and the website for Voices of Alabama. And with that, I will turn it back over, because I know we have even more questions now than before.
I want to say at the outset, thank you both for a wonderful discussion, and Athena for the presentation. And also, Athena, thank you for multitasking. So interviewing and answering questions at the same time. So but I have a question for you. Are there any specific questions you saw that you want to address, or you have Miss O'Neill address? Because I have quite a few questions, and
we do, but I think I'm going to relinquish some of the multitasking for now, and I'm going to let you, because I'm kind of close to it. So it would be nice to what you think we should be answering.
Okay, so we want to get to all the questions, because we have quite a few. I think some of them actually were answered in the discussion, so I'm going to be very selective here. So early question, and this one, so here, this one goes. I enjoyed the show, The Black Church, on PBS last night, and was wondering, and I believe this is for you, Miss O'Neill, I was wondering if you think the churches like Brown Chapel still hold the same importance as when you were growing up, and how has this changed through the years? So I believe you're addressing, do you believe that the Black church had the same importance now as it did back in the 60s?
You're on mute, Joyce.
You're mute.
I'm sorry, the Black church in Selma is still very important to our communities. In Selma, Alabama, the 10:30 or 11 o'clock hour is still the most segregated hour in our city. Our churches are still largely segregated. So our Black churches primarily have Black people, and the white churches have white people. You may have 1 or 2 people of a different race going to some of the churches, but very few. The churches still are the places where we have large group gatherings, and not just on Jubilee weekend. And our churches are still pretty much, the Black church is still pretty much the central point of the community for people to gather and for people to socialize. Although there are other things going on in the city now that we can participate in, a lot comes out of the church still. And the church still focuses on community, and the community focuses on the church.
Okay. Here's another one. I believe you touched upon this a little bit, but this question for you once again, Mr. Neal. We've come a long way since the Jim Crow South, and there's still more to be done for civil rights and equal opportunity for everyone. what advice would you give to civil rights activists today? And I believe you sort of touched upon it a little bit in terms of nonviolent protests, that that was something you usually say that should continue. But yeah, anything else you want to add in terms of, say, contemporary civil rights activists? So advice for them.
Well, I think I mentioned, or I said, be committed to the cause. Don't just drop in and drop out, because to make change, you have to be committed and you have to remain in the fight. And not just be temporary. If that's going to be your choice, then fight and continue to fight.
Okay. Athena, actually, I'm gonna switch to you for a second. So here I read the question, but I think basically what it was getting at here is as a graduate of Hood and sort of a model example of a graduate of Hood. So the question here goes, Athena, how do you go from being taught about civil rights to teaching people about rights Black people deserve? And I read that as, to say a little bit, as a graduate of Hood, how do you get to doing the good work you are doing with the Consortium?
That's a great question, because my actual history concentration is 18th and 19th century, antebellum slavery. That's historically my jam and my field. But really having to look at that, first of all, from the perspective of that is a part of the civil rights story as well. It's not slavery, comma, Jim Crow, comma, Black. That's not separate. In my perspective, it all is part of civil rights. It's all kind of a long timeline. So some people kind of focus on slavery. Some people focus on the 20th and the 21st century, but it's still the same fight, just in different historical times. So in terms of how I got here, I graduated in 2013 and kind of went on a job journey. I needed a break after college, which I'm sure many college students or alumni on this call. You need a break sometimes after you graduate. And I really wanted to get just kind of work experience. I wasn't sure about being in the museum field or a cultural institution at the time. But I ended up going on a historical pilgrimage to the church I was attending in Baltimore, following the Underground Railroad from New Orleans to Detroit. And we drove with about 8 or 9-year-olds, which, as you can imagine, was a lot to kind of navigate on top of the very heavy topic of the Underground Railroad. But that kind of made me realize I need to go back to school. I'm not finished learning, which has kind of been my motivation in terms of education. I even now don't feel like I was finished learning, but I definitely feel like there were more questions that I wanted to ask in an academic setting. And I ended up being recruited by the University of Alabama's American Studies Department to come down here and study, which opportunity for me because it's a 2-year program. I'll say this too, graduate school is very expensive, and there is a lot of discourse about, colleges and the tuition rates. So that was a very big decision for me to decide to leave working, because once you start working, you get used to being paid and having money. So leaving that opportunity to go back to school, but understanding that I really did want to be involved in teaching Black history. And first and foremost, to Black children, Black adults, not to exclude anyone else, but I just am very passionate about educating my community about our history. Civil rights, there's so many memes out there and so much misinformation about Black history, about the civil rights movement, about slavery, and I just became so passionate about rectifying that. That's partially what drove me back to school and touring plantations in New Orleans, which is another conversation. That's another piece of it. But I ended up getting connected with the consortium through Priscilla Hancock Cooper, who is our executive director. I met her at a museum conference and I was telling her about what my interest was. And she said, "Oh, I'm working on a project. Do you need an internship?" And I said, "Yes, absolutely. I need an internship." And this is right at the time when the consortium just got named to the World Monuments Fund Watch. And they were working on their very early projects. And the first one was a celebration in each of the cities acknowledging this great achievement. So I jumped right in as a graduate school intern and thankfully was offered a position before I graduated. So students on this call, it is possible to be employed in the humanities field. Do not let anyone tell you it can't happen. There are absolutely jobs out there for us to tell the story and be ourselves. I know it's hard. I know there's a lot of imperfect situations, but it is worth it to continue to push and fight and change the museum field and cultural heritage field. One thing about the consortium, working with the sites of the consortium, it has expanded my definition of a cultural institution and a historical institution, because these churches, you know, they are historical and they are cultural. They're not, they're not an art museum, they're not a history museum per se, but they are just as important, if not more so, because they have been foundational blocks, keystones of the community, places where funerals are held, marriages are held, baptisms are held, meetings, parties. I met my wife or I met my husband at the church, or at the Benmore Hotel, or the homes, you know, people coming into the private homes and having that impact. So for me, that's kind of how I got here and how I look at what I do, telling that story and why it's so important, and really to expand not just my personal experience, but everyone's experience. So when they see these churches or drive past the church, you know, there's places in Frederick too that you may drive past, you may see the marker and you don't stop to look at it. And you don't think, okay, in the context of this neighborhood, what does this mean? So that's really kind of what the consortium does and how I came into it. I hope that answers your question.
No. That was, I believe you provide a lot of insight and encouragement for students here at Hood. Excellent. I believe we can ask maybe one more question. Tamlin, or are we going over, or should we take a couple more questions? What do you think?
I think a couple more.
Couple more? Okay. So here's one for you, Ms. O'Neill. It was actually related to a question that I had, but I'll go ahead and read this question here. So it said, would you say that the struggles endured and atrocities witnessed helped to build a very strong foundation in your faith at a young age? And did you have moments when you questioned God due to the events that transpired?
Let me answer the last part of that first. There was never a time when I questioned God. I did realize that because a lot of this was based in my church, I realized that my church was answering a call. So that helped to renew my faith, because the church was answering the call. I did see the atrocities, but my faith did not waver because of the atrocities. And my faith was borne out after everything was over, because there was a change. And although that change was not everlasting, there was a change that I saw immediately after the voting rights bill was signed into law on August 6, 1965. So no, my faith did not waver to the point that I lost hope. As a matter of fact, the movement in Selma gave me a lot of hope and increased my faith.
Okay. And that's related to a question I have. I'll just sort of interject here as a co-host. And I actually found a clip. So Athena, there's like an extended clip. I hope you're aware of this. There's an extended clip somewhere on the internet with some sort of news organization that I believe is from the film. And Ms. O'Neill, one of the things you said in terms of the movement was that people generally think that it was a political movement, but you said, well, really it was a spiritual movement. And I was wondering if you sort of, given the last question, could you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, I always saw the voting rights movement in Selma, and primarily because it was based in the church. It was a spiritual movement because the mass meetings always started with singing those freedom songs, and then there were prayers and scriptures, and then they weren't necessarily so much speeches as they were sermons. You know, we would say Dr. King spoke, but what he spoke was a sermon. When Reverend Dr. Abernathy spoke, what he spoke was a sermon. When Andy Young spoke, it was a sermon. So being in the church and during the mass meetings, the clapping and the singing, it was all very spiritual. So it was a spiritual movement with political and social consequences, is what I always say. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. It was a spiritual movement with political and social consequences. We were always on our feet during a mass meeting. You couldn't keep your seat during a mass meeting because of the singing, "Oh, freedom." If my voice was a little better, I'd give you a flavor of it, but I'm having some problems with sinuses right now. But all of those, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. This little light of mine. These songs started off every single mass meeting. There were no mass meetings that started with just a sermon or a speech. They started with the singing.
Okay. And I believe we can fit in one last question. And I want to get to this because this is actually from a high school student. And here I'll just sort of read the last part here. This high school student has a question. Do you feel like we are progressively tackling racism going backwards in time? Or do you believe that basically the past is repeating it in itself?
I believe the past. Yeah. I believe the past is repeating itself. I can see all the vestiges of the racism and all the vestiges of wanting to return this nation to a nation of separates. And if you recall, Dr. King said at one time that the Klan would eventually be in three-piece suits. And we're seeing that. If we see what just played out in our Congress, the Klan is in three-piece suits. If we see and admit to the inability of our Congress people to do the right thing, the Klan is in three-piece suits. So I think a lot of times we go backwards. We're not taking too many steps forward because in recent years, we're just continually taking backward steps. And that's what we need to be alert to. And that's what our young people, when they're protesting, know what you're protesting. Know the facts. And know what you want to see as a result, of your protest. And don't give up, because it's going to take young people now to turn this nation around. We are in a sad state of affairs in these United States of America. Black people need to be vigilant again about what's going on. We don't need to hide our heads in the sand, because there are forces out there that are working day and night to turn the table.
And I just want to say, just really quickly, that there are times when we study history that we say, oh, I wouldn't have done that. If I had lived in that time, I would have done this and this. Well, we're living in that time. Like Joyce said, we have taken steps backward, and now we are living in that time. And if you don't feel comfortable protesting, there might be something else you could do. Maybe you could help with organizing. You could help with having supplies to help the people who are protesting. There are many roles in a movement. It's not just the people leading, being in the streets, because that is it's risk. And not everyone feels comfortable with that, but it might be someone who films it, someone who's willing to collect the stories of people right afterwards, an instant oral history, if you will, of documenting what is happening right now. So I would say, one, whatever you're doing now is probably what you would have done back then. So let's not be as judgmental of the civil rights movement. And then also, if you feel like you want to get involved, find a way that works for you. And that could look like almost anything, but definitely take the words of Joyce and her story and use it to make a difference, whatever that looks like in your life, whether Frederick or wherever you are.
May I add quickly that during the voting rights movement in Selma, there were very few leaders. There were more foot soldiers than there were leaders. There were more, quote unquote, common people marching than there were leaders. So everybody can play a role somewhere. The church became a hotel, a cafeteria, a meeting place for strategizing. It was everything, and there were people feeding into those different roles who were not the Dr. Kings and the Dr. Abernathys and the Andy Young and the Bonds and all of those. And even Malcolm X came and spoke to the students. I didn't mention that. He came and spoke 2 weeks before he was assassinated in 1965. And so there are a lot of roles for you to play, as Athena stated. You don't just have to be out on the front lines, because you need those legs and feet and hands and hearts, as was stated at the beginning of this. And in all of you can be the hands, the feet, and the heart.
And I think it's an excellent end to our talk here, and a good call for action. I would like to again extend a thank you to both of you for attending and giving a very enlightening discussion. I would thank the audience. So we were able to get everybody's questions, but hopefully we got through most of them and answered a lot of things. And here, on behalf of also of Tamlin, certainly we would thank the Political Science Department and African American Studies Department, but also to thank the History Department and the National Endowment of the Humanities Council for their support. And again, this is just the first of a series this semester of talks on race and public policy, so race politics and public policy. We have another event coming up in April, which hopefully everyone can attend. We'll have more details coming, but it's going to involve, on one hand, inviting some local Black Lives Matter activists on a panel to get to talk about their work, and also a panel of Black Lives Matter muralists. So we'll have more details coming for that, which will be in April. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And I'm sure everybody's giving a virtual hand clap to Ms. O'Neill and Ms. Richardson. I thought it was an excellent talk tonight. And everyone have a good evening. Tammy, you want to come in here? Anything you want to add?
No, I didn't. I was just
take away your shine.
Give the hand clap. The virtual.
Yeah.
But I don't want to repeat what you just said, so I won't. But all of that Dr. Allen just said, we are so appreciative. We are fortunate, and we realize that tonight. And so we hope to take this and use it as a call for action. And so with that, I think we can say good night.
Good night, and thank you.
Good night. Thank you so much.